Hi, it's time for another chapter by chapter recap. This time we are in Leviticus chapter 12 all the way to Numbers chapter 6. If you don't know already, my name is Corie. I work with my family at a ministry called Bible Discovery. We have a show and a YouTube channel called Bible Discovery TV. And our mission is to help people just like you read through the Bible in a year. And we do this every year. It is our passion. We also have a Bible study guide that we will send to you new each month, and there is a daily Bible study that you can go through either on your own or you can watch it as a companion to the program. It's up to you. But the purpose of this video today on Saturday is to get you caught up with the reading. It's a chapter by chapter recap of everything that you were assigned to read this week in order to get to Revelation by the end of December. So let me get you caught up if you've fallen behind, or let me test your memory. So again, Leviticus 12 to Numbers 6. I know this time of year is really hard. This is when a lot of people start bailing either on their Bible reading or on their New Year's resolutions. And this is not a very kind portion of scripture to those of us who don't know ancient history very well or ancient cultures very well. But that's why I'm here. I'm going to help you. Hopefully we can get through some of these laws, and I'm going to hopefully help you understand a little bit better some of the things that are going on. So Leviticus chapter 12, here we are. We've landed in this purification chapter. So it's talking about ritual purity and ritual impurity. So not moral sin or goodness here. We're talking about ceremonially being clean in the presence of God. So in chapter 12, it's specifically purification after childbirth. And we learned that when a woman would have a male child, she would be considered ritually unclean for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, she would get a break from that so that the baby boy could be circumcised. After that, she would have to go back into this ritually impure state for 33 days and then be cleansed afterwards. If a woman had a baby girl, this time period was longer, and it obviously was not interrupted for circumcision because female circumcision was not a thing, has never been a thing in ancient Israel. So 14 days for a girl was that period of 7 days for a boy. That was doubled to 14 for a girl. And then another 66 days for the mother to be cleansed from her bleeding. Now, the big question here is, why? Is this sexist? What's going on? So this cleansing period for a baby boy obviously had to be cut short for him to be able to be circumcised on the 8th day. Otherwise, he would be considered unclean with his mom, and his mom wouldn't be able to be there for the ceremony. So that wouldn't work. So just practically speaking, the mother's and boys' time of cleansing was cut short for that reason. But perhaps also this, because that doesn't fully explain it, why the timing would be doubled for a girl. So the question is here, why would a girl be seen as more ritually impure or needing a longer time period of purification than a baby boy? And one of the answers that a lot of people have put forward is perhaps the mother's time of cleansing was also keeping in mind the baby girl's fertility as well, her future bleeding, her fertility, therefore the time was doubled. Okay, it's also important to note here, just on that childbirth was not considered a sin. This is not the same thing. You know, God, it was a command of God, be fruitful and multiply and increase on the earth. We get that back in the very first chapters of the Bible in Genesis. Childbirth was not a sin. So why was there this time period of impurity, and why was an offering needed to be given by the mother at the tabernacle in order to cleanse her from this time? Well, the answer seems to be because childbirth involves a lot of blood. And whenever there's the spilling of blood in ancient Israel, that was something that needed to be dealt with in a ritual way, because the belief was that life was in the blood and life was God's domain. So whenever you were dealing with blood, it was very serious business. And in the chapter, this is even this period of impurity impurity and then purification was even linked with menstruation, which also is another loss of blood. So that connection with blood here is very clearly made. So it all has to do with blood and the transference of life here. So it is a symbolic thing rather than a sinful thing. Okay, Leviticus chapter 13, regulations about skin diseases. Basically, this is a what do we do? And we see throughout this chapter that people with rashes or boils or a breakout on their skin would come to the priests to be examined. And the whole idea behind this was that the priests needed to determine whether or not this was a contagious or infectious disease. If, in fact, it turned out to be a contagious or infectious disease, the people would be forced to live outside of the camp. Now, remember, at this time period, the Israelites are in the wilderness. They have the tabernacle in the middle of their camp. They're not in the promised land yet, but the person with an infectious skin disease had to camp outside of the camp, and they had to wear torn clothes, keep their hair unkempt, veil the bottom of their face, and yell out unclean when they were going about their business around other people so that they would know to stay away from them. Now, this tearing of the clothes and the unkempt hair and things of that nature is generally associated with mourning elsewhere in the scriptures. So, and this makes sense. If you're being ousted from your community because you've caught an infectious disease, it makes sense that you would show that outwardly by being in perpetual mourning. We also learn what they needed to do about mold and mildew in fabrics. And it's much the same process where there's an examination, a quarantine, and then, just because these are fabrics, not people, at the end you would dispose of the fabric by burning to get rid of that mold and mildew. Chapter 14 was what to do if someone recovered from an infectious skin disease or if they got healed. So there's this process of ritually purifying the person involving examination and sacrifices, and a really weird sacrifice that involves the sacrifice of one bird while letting the other bird go. It seems to be related to the sacrifice of the scapegoat that we're going to get to later, but this likely symbolizes the person being brought back to life, essentially from this place of being the walking, living dead to being made alive again. So one bird gets sacrificed and dies, and the other one, the same kind of bird, gets set free. That whole idea of being back to life. So it's interesting anyway. Also, we learn about cleansing a house from mold and mildew, which also involves that weird bird sacrifice. Chapter 15, we learn all these different ways that people could become ritually unclean or impure. And all of these in chapter 15 involve personal bodily function, most of them normal, completely normal bodily functions. These things weren't inherently sinful. They were things instead, rather than being sinful, they reminded you of your humanness, your otherness, other than God. So there was this ideal of being holy and because God was holy, and then these things that reminded you of the fact that you weren't a God, that you were human. An important note here in chapter 15, cultural note, is about human intercourse. And here, intercourse was not and is not a sin, but it did render the couple ritually unclean until that evening. And this is important because this separates human sexuality from the worship practices of Israel's God and the tabernacle. Now remember, their goal is to go into the land of Canaan, and in the land of Canaan, human sexuality was a part of pagan worship rituals, and there was fertility cults and cult prostitutes and all of these things. So not only was this something that was spoken against in the Bible, nowhere is this condoned or ordered by God, but now here, sexuality very clearly, or sexual intercourse very clearly makes someone ritually unclean, not able to participate in worship or sacrifices at the tabernacle until they've completed their time of cleansing. So this is really important here to note that there are very real and cultural reasons why God would have instituted these laws in Israel. Okay, chapter 16, we learn about the Day of Atonement, which was a day of atoning or sacrificing for all of Israel's sins. We get instructions for Aaron and all the high priests after him on how they were to go into the Holy of Holies. They weren't allowed to just go in there. It was only once a year, and there was very specific instructions for them on what they had to do in order to not die when they went into the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant, and chapter 16 is where you can find it. We also learn about the Scapegoat Sacrifice. Again, there's a lot of interesting scholarship that's written on the meaning of the Scapegoat Sacrifice, but essentially there was two goats. One was sacrificed, and the other one, all of the sins of Israel were confessed and symbolically laid onto the goat's head, and the goat then was sent out into the wilderness alive to carry Israel's sins far, far away from her, never to be brought back again. Chapter 17, we learn that sacrifices and offerings must be made at the tabernacle. So any sort of sacrifice outside of this in the wilderness is prohibited. There's a specific mention to goat idols that were apparently a problem going on in Israel. We learn here again, here comes more blood issues, that the Israelites were never to eat blood, the blood of animals. This is where we get that the life is in the blood phrase. It's here in chapter 17. Even when the Israelites were out hunting, they were commanded that they had to drain the blood of an animal and then bury the blood before they could consume the animal. So a really serious thing. In chapter 18, we get laws about different sexual relationships, and verse 3 clearly states the reason why these different relationships are outlawed in Israel: to be different than the surrounding cultures, to be different from Egypt, where they came from, to be different from the Canaanites, where they're going to. We also have child sacrifice being forbidden here, which, I mean, children, they're a result of human relationships. So child sacrifice, getting rid of unwanted children to Molech, forbidden. And God's authority, importantly, is used here. If there's any question, well, why shouldn't we do this? Why shouldn't we do that? God's authority is used in this chapter. Basically, that he knows best. In chapter 19, we get various laws in regards to society. Just one example would be for verse 17. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. It's interesting. The foil to hate here is rebuking and honesty, which is really interesting. I really liked that when I was reading it this time. Chapter 20, the punishments are described for breaking various laws. Most of the punishments here in chapter 20 are either death, so capital punishment, or exclusion from Israel, being cut off from their people. Chapter 21, we have various rules for priests and the high priest, like who they could mourn for, who they could become ceremonially unclean for, whose funeral they could go for when they were on duty, who they could and couldn't marry, various laws like this, all in chapter 21. In chapter 22, we get rules for priests on how they should treat the sacrifices. Remember, not all of the sacrifices, but some of the sacrifices of Israel, only part of the animal would be burned to God, and the rest would be given to the priests as their food. So this was all about how to treat those sacrifices with respect, and who exactly in the priest's family or in the priest's care could eat and partake of that meat as well. And it turns out just anyone who was a direct dependent of the priest, but just not hired workers or visitors to his home. We also learn what animals are not acceptable as sacrifices within, the sheep, bull, ram category. Okay, chapter 23 is all about describing the festivals of Israel. So we've got the weekly Sabbath rest, Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first fruit offerings, which have to do with the two different harvest times of Israel, the early and late. We have the Feast of Weeks, which is also known as Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So that's all described for us in a nice, neat package in Leviticus chapter 23. Chapter 24, we have this overall theme of God's holiness, which, you know, that's the whole book of Leviticus. But here we have that microcosm of God's holiness in chapter 24. You know, in the tent tabernacle, only the best olive oil was to be burned in the lamps inside the tabernacle. Only the finest flour was to be used to bake the bread of the tabernacle. And then we get this really interesting story of a blasphemer in Israel being put to death. And the scenario is, it's this half Egyptian, half Israelite fighting with a full Israelite, and the Egyptian Israelite uses the name of God and curses the name of God to insult the full Israelite. So he has blasphemed by cursing the name of God. He has blasphemed the holy name of God, the holiness of God. And so now, as a unit, the Israelites will put him to death. So, chapter 25, we learn about the Sabbath year. We all know about this concept of the weekly Sabbath, taking a rest every week, but then every Sabbath year in Israel, they were to give the land a rest and not farm it, not cultivate it for an entire year. Every 50th year, they were to have a year of Jubilee, an entire year of Jubilee where property that had been sold within Israel would be returned to its original owners. So remember, the Israelites are going to get tribal allotments, portions, inheritances in the promised land. And so as a way of that not getting muddled, or different tribes, you know, getting a monopoly essentially on the land of Israel, every 50th year, it was supposed to reset. Except for houses in walled cities. There's some exceptions in there. And it's interesting to look at all the little details that are given to us in chapter 25. We also learn about slavery and hired service and how that worked with the year of Jubilee, which is really interesting as well. Chapter 26, we get rewards for following God and punishments for disobeying God. So it's this covenant thing again. So if the Israelites followed God, followed him alone, they were promised dependable rain and good harvest, peace and protection from enemies, and the presence of God dwelling with them. So just overall, that sounds very good. The punishment for disobedience, you know, it starts with enemies invading and Israel being defeated, and then there's a whole bunch of terrible things. There's all of these steps. If you don't respond then this is going to happen. If you still don't respond, this is going to happen. If you still don't respond, this is going to happen. If you still don't respond, you're going to be exiled. But even in that exile, Israel being split up as a nation and, you know, taken as captives to other nations, there's still hope, because God said that he will always remember the covenant of Abraham. And as the people start repenting of their sins, that God will still fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. Chapter 27 is really interesting. The vows of dedication to the service of God and how to get out of those vows of dedication early. So these are also called redemption laws, and they are tremendously misunderstood. So let's just break it down. As an Israelite, you could dedicate yourself or your child. We see this in Samuel's life, you know, Hannah dedicating Samuel to God. We're going to get there in 1 Samuel. You can dedicate yourself to service in God's temple for the Levites, essentially. Then if you want out early from that agreed upon time period, or if it was your whole life and you wanted to get out early, you would have to redeem yourself by paying a price. You were basically recompensing the tabernacle for the years of lost service in your agreement, because, you know, service, hired service, costs money, and so you're volunteering for that, and so now you're going to pay up the difference. Now, the controversy has come in the differing amounts designated, first for age group, but then also secondly for gender. So a young, strong man in his prime there's a higher redemption price than for a woman in that same category, and her price is higher than, say, someone who's very old or someone who's very young, regardless of gender. So what is going on here? This obviously, especially in today's day and age, really, really sits with us poorly. We tend to think that the Bible is putting a value on human life here, and men are more valuable than women, and younger people are better than older people. And that's simply not what the Bible is saying here. The context of this is the value of work. It's what is the labor of this person worth, not what is their life worth, not what is their soul worth, not what, is a man better than a woman. No, that's not the discussion that's going on in Leviticus chapter 27. So the question then becomes, was this price set based off of the going labor cost, in that time period? Was it just general labor cost? Was it just the going rate for hired workers? Or was this rather based off of the type of work, the type of jobs that would be given to a young man versus an old man, or a young woman versus an old woman? We don't know. We don't really know. But again, ladies and gents, this doesn't appear to be a statement of the relative value of human life or human souls. Rather, this is about what is the cost of their labor in that time period. Okay, so that finishes off Leviticus chapter 27, and we are going to do the first 6 chapters of Numbers. Now, Numbers as a book is really interesting. It is a transitional book. It talks about the rebellion and the death of the Exodus generation, those people who came out of Egypt with Moses through the Exodus. And it talks about this new generation, their children, getting ready to go into the promised land. So there's a transition that happens in Numbers that's really interesting. So we're only going to get a few chapters in, but the very first chapter of Numbers, Numbers 1, they take a census in the wilderness that God tells them to take, an account of all the people, except for the Levites. They get their own census in a few chapters. But here it's just the rest of Israel. Before you're getting ready to go in the promised land, take an accounting of everyone so that you know how many people you have, probably for warfare as well. Okay, so chapter 2, we learn how the camp of the Israelites was arranged around the tabernacle. This may seem arbitrary when you're reading it, but guys, this chapter has been very pivotal in understanding the date of Numbers, of the book of Numbers, of this chapter, of this history of Israel in the wilderness. In fact, on February 5th's program on Bible Discovery TV, you can find it on YouTube or on BibleDiscoveryTV.com. I put a segment on that show, on yesterday's program, that is talking about the organization of Israel's camp and how it has cultural foils and cultural comparatives in ancient Egypt and really nowhere else. So it's a really interesting thing. But I digress. Okay, we can't get into that right now. We don't have time. So that was chapter 2, all about the camp. Chapter 3, we have this different census of the Levites. We learn about their internal divisions. So it's not just the tribe of Levites, the tribe of Levi, but then there's 3 subclans, the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites. And they all did different things for the tabernacle. In chapter 4, we learn what those different things were. The Kohathites, which was Moses's and Aaron's family, but of course Aaron's family were the priests, but all the rest of them, all of their relatives, the Kohathites, carried the furniture and like the Ark of the Covenant, all of the articles of the tabernacle. The Gershonites carried the curtains and the ropes, all the materials, and the Merarites carried the frames and the tent poles and the bases and all the tools necessary to set up the tent tabernacle and the camp. Chapter 5 is when they instituted the overall purity of the camp that was required and that we learn about back in Leviticus. Specifically, people with skin diseases were made to go out. They're told again that they need to deal with sin by confession and sacrifice and making restitution with one another. And also, we get this really interesting account of what to do what an Israelite man should do if he suspects his wife of adultery. So this is essentially saying deal with your suspicions as well. Deal with your sin, but then deal with your suspicions before God. Numbers chapter 6, we get the Nazirite vow. So people taking a Nazirite vow would dedicate a certain chunk of time to God. They would become holy to God. And because of that, they had to refrain from doing several things. From drinking anything fermented, wine, beer, vinegar. They were not allowed to eat grapes or raisins or anything of that nature. They couldn't cut their hair or shave their beards in the case of a man. They couldn't come in contact with a dead body. And what's interesting is that some scholars think that people who dedicated themselves to the Lord back in Leviticus chapter 27, those people who there was redemption laws for, some scholars think that those people would have had to have taken a Nazirite vow. It's an interesting thought. Also, in the very last portion of Numbers chapter 6, we hear of a blessing that the priests were supposed to pronounce over the Israelites. And just a personal story, my dad and my mom pastored a church here in my hometown for about 16 years. And after every service, my dad would use this as the benediction. So he would say this blessing to people. He would change it just a little bit, but it goes, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. And I know it, I memorized it off by heart, but I was glancing down because my dad read a different version that I was doing this from, and I want to say it with that other version. Glancing down, Dad, if you're reading this, it's seared into my mind. I do know it. You can quiz me later. Give me a call. Okay, we've made it. Leviticus chapter 12 all the way to Numbers 6. I hope that you are doing well in these times. Here in Canada where I am, we are still under lockdown orders. Hopefully that will loosen up this week, but we don't know. So I hope that you're doing well. And look, if you need to reach out. You can call our office. My sister-in-law and her twin sister actually run the offices in Canada. And we have some great people also answering the phones in our American office. So if you need help, if you need someone to pray with you, please, honestly, reach out. Also, comment below. I try my best to hang out in the comment section and answer questions and talk with you guys. I love reading your comments and your stories and even your questions. You guys have had some amazing questions. We turned some into a blog post as well. I might do a few videos based off your questions as well. So all that to say, I hope you have a really great week. I hope that you are able to power through these sections of the law. I know that it is not easy reading, but I am here with you. I'm doing the reading with you every week. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time.